Good evening, everyone. My name is Adnan Aamir, and I am here live with the seventh episode of Live with Adnan Aamir. And the topic of our today's show is status of Belt and Road in Asia, and we will talk about Belt and Road in general and China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in particular. Our guest today is Mr. Andrew Small. Andrew is one of the most quoted experts on China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. He's a senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Apart from that, he's also an associate senior policy fellow at European Council on Foreign Relations. He has authored the oft-quoted book China-Pakistan Access, and recently he has published a report titled Returning to the Shadows, China, Pakistan, and the Fate of CPEC. So, hello, Andrew. Thank you for joining us in this show.
Hello, Adnan. Thanks for the chance to join you today.
And as I mentioned in my intro, you have recently published a report, Returning to the Shadows, China, Pakistan, and the Fate of CPEC. And in this report, you are argued at one point that CPEC is the most conclusive demonstration that BRI model is no longer sustainable. So would you just elaborate on that how the progress of CPEC so far has made BRI unsustainable?
So I think, the report goes through and essentially explains how we moved from the sort of initial high hopes and kind of transformative, game-changing expectations for what CPEC was supposed to achieve to the kind of stalling of the initiative and paring back of the initiative to something that, while it's still moving ahead and there's been a sort of resumption of activities recently, is a substantially slimmed down version from what was originally expected, and the nature of the initiative has really changed quite fundamentally. I think the initial scale was going to be considerably larger, but also the expectation on China's part was that this was going to be a cluster of projects that could have a transformative impact on Pakistan's economy and even to a certain extent its politics as a result. The challenges that I think China's run into in Pakistan, which in many ways should have been about the friendliest country possible for the Belt and Road, I think is illustrative of the fact that if some of these projects are going to have the sorts of challenges that we've seen, even in a case such as Pakistan, where the level of public support for China and the level of governmental support was as high as it was, I think it shows that, and I think it's shown to China that the kind of high transformative expectations that they might have had for the initiative as a whole can no longer really be expected to be fulfilled, and that's what we're seeing on the Belt and Road in general. We're seeing a downscaling, we're seeing a paring back. We're seeing sums of money that are considerably lower than when the first phase of the BRI was moving ahead, where this kind of speed and scale was what the whole thing was about. Now there's a much more judicious approach to financial and political risk than we saw back then, and I think a more realistic sense probably of the sorts of things that might actually be achieved through it. And CPEC, of course, being the flagship, as it was originally called, at least for the Belt and Road, and in that sense also the place where these projects moved ahead fastest and was probably the largest cluster of projects envisaged under the BRI in the first few years, I think has been a kind of test run in a certain sense for China to see whether it could pull off this more kind of complex set of developmental objectives that it had in the case of Pakistan and for the Belt and Road as a whole. And I think there's a realization on China's part that that's not going to happen. And so instead, I think we're seeing a more modest set of goals for both for CPEC and for the Belt and Road as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned that Pakistan is like a long-time ally of China, and CPEC was supposed to be a friendly experience for China and for the Belt and Road. So why this miscalculation took place? Was it in the part of China or Pakistan, or there were some like unforeseen circumstances that were not taken into the account?
I think China has at points overestimated a couple of things. One, in the relationship with Pakistan, Where they've generally at points been perhaps the more realistic party of the two, but there have been these moments in which they've overestimated their influence and their potential to kind of steer certain Pakistani political choices in ways that have not actually proved possible. I think we saw that in the early stages of Chinese efforts with the peace process in Afghanistan and the reconciliation talks with the Taliban, where I think they expected to be able to push Pakistan harder than proved possible. And I think to a certain extent, what they've overestimated in this case was the scope to take the Chinese development model and apply it in a country like Pakistan, where the scope to be able to do this kind of centrally directed transformative set of economic plans of the sort that in different ways you'd seen in China itself was going to run into a lot more political, economic, and other challenges. And China just didn't have the depth of understanding of Pakistan beyond some of the kind of narrow elite level contacts to be as realistic as they needed to be about this in the first instance. I think, yes, on the Pakistani side, there were also sort of perhaps some excessively inflated hopes, but in many ways the PMLN got a lot of what they wanted out of CPEC. I mean, they got a number of the energy projects that they'd wanted to have pushed ahead. They had actually got a significant cluster of them in place by the time of the next election. But also Pakistan was going through some of the same cyclical economic problems that it had in the past. I think there'd always been a premise for CPEC that things would look different if you were able to boost growth to 7% a year or something like this. I think there was on both sides an underestimation of the degree to which some of the typical economic problems that have been there would come back to bite the Pakistani economy and CPEC itself. And by the time we were getting to late 2017 and the balance payment situation was worsening and the overall economic picture was starting to deteriorate, even before you ran into some of the political headwinds that you really ran into particularly intensively in that period, including then the election of Imran Khan. Even before that, CPEC was starting to face a number of economic issues that in some ways might have been foreseen. In some ways, it may have been that China could have conditioned some of its economic investments around some of the potential reforms to some of the sectors that they were involved in. Instead, they just kind of they went ahead with a series of projects that, without, I think, attempting to do any of the kind of either wider political constituency building work that they might have done, or I think conditioning more of these investments on certain changes that would be needed to make a success of them. And so I think both sides have learned lessons from the whole experience. And again, I think we are now getting to a place where things are being understood in a slightly more realistic way, politically and economically, than the kind of inflated hopes that there were in the earlier stages.
Okay, all right. So coming to the CPEC, one of the most important or one of the most favorite parts of the CPEC for the journalist and for the media was the figure itself. So it started from the $46 billion, then there was 55, and at one point it was $100 billion. And you have mentioned about this in your book, and you said that the operative figure should be 25 billion at the moment. So from the very outset, was there a figure, a realistic figure that could have been quoted for the CPEC, or it has always been murky?
I mean, the interesting thing is the initial figures that had been agreed during Xi Jinping's visit, which was about $28 billion, is not so far away from where we are at the moment. What got quickly announced simultaneously was this $46 billion figure, which was essentially all of the projects that were under negotiation. The Chinese numbers have tended to be more conservative. The Chinese numbers, which the embassy in Islamabad has released periodically have essentially been based on the projects that are either underway or completed. Some of these larger figures have always been about a set of projects that in some cases never ended up moving beyond the negotiating stage. So yes, if every single one of the projects that have even been talked about seriously had ended up going ahead, then you would have had some of these larger figures. But in practice, and if you trace through, you can go back even to the embassy website and go and trace through from the speeches of Chinese officials and from some of the press releases and things at different junctures. The Chinese side has released numbers, and they've released them only on this kind of much more limited basis. And it was at about $19 billion by late 2017, and it's stuck at that number for some time thereafter. And it's only really been in the last 6 to 9 months that the number started to kind of creep up again. And I think that's been a relatively, I think the numbers that have come from the embassy have tended to be fairly realistic assessment of what's actually been moving ahead. The challenge is that people continue to write about CPEC on the basis of these very large figures, even though some of the projects that comprised those large figures are in some instances not even being talked about by the two sides anymore. And I mean, we see the same thing when in the context of China-Iran at the moment, where people seize on a very, very large number and start talking about this as if it's in any sense realistic that it's going to happen. And I think we should also learn the lesson from the CPEC experience to be quite clear about what's actually possible and not jump on these hyperbolic figures that get kicked around. And I mean, actually on the Chinese side, they were a bit concerned that the figures being talked about were so high in public, because their other partners would come to them and say, well, we want tens of $billions worth of investments from you as well. And the Chinese officials would say, well, actually, it's not really that. It's a moment. They say, well, the Pakistani government is going around saying, this is the number. It's 46 billion. It's 62 billion. It's whatever. And it's actually one of the reasons I think that the Chinese embassy started being more proactive in giving its own messages out on CPEC, which you started to see at a certain juncture, because I think the sense was that some of the narratives that were emerging in Pakistan, if China didn't involve itself in some of this a bit more closely, were leading to excessive expectations and a false understanding actually of what was underway.
Okay, so based on the future trajectory of CPEC and the projects that can be realistically completed, do you have a ballpark figure in mind? What will be the total value of CPEC projects once it's over into 2030?
I mean, there's always a challenge with CPEC in a certain sense, in that, I mean, we're talking about an ongoing and what will be a long-running economic relationship between China and Pakistan. Actually, if you look at some of the projects taking place outside CPEC, you have some quite significant ones. You have the nuclear power plants. Diamabasha would probably be taking place, is currently supposed to take place outside CPEC. And so I think it's, although it's useful to think about, there are certain specific things in terms of financing streams and that mean that a CPEC project is slightly different from a non-CPEC project. But I think you have to look at this in a longer term context of all of the kinds of investments that are going ahead, and that that is going to be a larger figure. I mean, it's not in the end unrealistic that you get to. Certainly, if you have, and as you've written about recently, there's still question marks and challenges about whether things like ML1, the railway line upgrades go ahead. But I think if we took the projects that have been kind of slated more recently, ML1, a couple of the hydroelectric dams, and then you put some of the other non-CPEC projects into the mix as well, you are talking about 30-something billion, possibly 40 billion, around that if all of these things go ahead. I mean, the economic situation is challenging right now. So even though there is a sort of this mini revival underway, and even though China is evidently prepared to provide certain forms of support to some of these new projects, there are still some question marks about whether these things actually move ahead. And really, if you look at what played out with CPEC, the real energy took place between 2015 and late 2017, and since then, not a huge amount has moved ahead on a significant scale. I mean, you've been wrapping up some of the existing projects, and even what's being talked about now, beyond a couple of these new, bigger, larger scale projects, which still have some of these uncertainties around them. We're still kind of talking about things that should have happened a few years ago. The special economic zones should have seen a lot more progress. The Gwadar projects had kind of stalled and have still clearly not transformed Gwadar into a functioning port in a serious way, and I think that's still going to be very challenging. So, I mean, the economic conditions, of course, at the moment make some of this challenging. But I think realistically, if they have found a kind of new equilibrium between the two sides, and they are capable of pressing ahead with a few more of these projects, then you will get to other will be 10, 12, 13 billion dollars worth or so, particularly if the very largest of them goes ahead, like ML1 in particular.
Okay, so here in Pakistan, like one of the another contentious issues about CPEC is the term corridor. And you have also mentioned about it that the term corridor is just speculation at the moment, and connecting Gwadar to Xinjiang with road and railways and with like massive flow of transportation and with cargo movement, this is not going to happen. So if was there a plan of a corridor under CPEC from the outset, or like if not, then why the name corridor itself was attached to it?
I mean, I think the concept of a corridor is an evocative one. I mean, going back even before CPEC, when you had plans for the transport and energy corridor and some of the kind of some of the comparable that prefigured CPEC, there's always been this notion that I think has tended to be more strongly held in Pakistan than on the Chinese side, which is that Pakistan's strategic economic geography is what's of value to China, that access to the Indian Ocean, the land route out from China or something has strategic significance, and that China should want to take advantage of this. And this goes back decades. And even the Karakoram Highway itself was partly informed by some of this thinking, even back to the original phase of moving ahead with that in the 1960s. But I would say on the Chinese side, there's tended to be a view that says, look, this is fine when strategists are sitting around talking about these things, but this has to function economically for the firms that would be using it. It has to make some sort of commercial sense. It has to make some sort of financial and economic sense if you're going to press ahead with things like pipelines, or that you can expect to have some kind of running thoroughfare of goods flowing up and down the KKH. And whenever they've done these assessments, when the Chinese energy specialists or some of their the banks or some of the other commercial actors have looked at it, they've just said it's not feasible. It doesn't make sense to push ahead with anything other than at the moment, what we've been seeing, some road upgrades, some of the tunneling work that has tended to take place in the areas that are landslide prone. And yes, it would be useful if you had an all-weather surface that you were able to run even the existing road all the year round. But the topography just makes it very difficult. It's just extremely challenging. And this is not even to get into any of the security questions or the Baluchistan situation or any of these things. It's simply that the topography around the Karakoram makes all of these things extremely challenging. And of course, the actual flows of goods work perfectly well by sea, and most of the locations in which active trading is taking place tend to be coast to coast rather than the Chinese interior. I mean, Xinjiang is still relatively underdeveloped by comparison. And so for a whole host of these reasons, it has not made economic sense from the Chinese perspective, certainly, to go ahead with any of these sorts of more souped up potential measures steps that you could take, pipelines and railway lines and all of these sorts of things. And so these are not included in the plans, of course. I mean, every now and then people talk about these things. Every now and then there are feasibility studies undertaken, but at no point in the entire period in which CPEC was being put together has there been a juncture in which you've had serious planning for a major increase in cross-border activities. It's just not been the focal point. And so all of these kind of early debates in particular, which have somewhat receded around corridors and corridor routes and things like that, I think in the end, this was and remains a large-scale investment package in diffuse parts of the country. And yes, there are some internal infrastructure upgrades. And yes, Gwadar is intended to be kind of fixed, as it were, at least made to achieve some basic level of functionality. But I don't see any planning taking place in the Pakistani government or in the Chinese government for a corridor in the sense of a regular and significant flow of goods or energy or anything at all going up and down between Xinjiang and the Indian Ocean. And I don't see that as being realistic. And I don't see anyone involved in it who sees it as realistic.
And you mentioned Gwadar and it achieving a certain degree of functionality. So, you also mentioned in the report that the Pakistani officials have assured US and other Western countries that no foreign country would be allowed to establish a naval base at Gwadar, and then Gwadar will not be used as a corridor for connecting it with Xinjiang. So all the investments that China is making in Gwadar, which are grants, as you have mentioned also in your report. So what is the ultimate utility of Gwadar for the Chinese? And this is also a very pressing question here in Pakistan, that why is China investing in Gwadar if it does not serve the purpose as a naval base or even to transport goods from Arabian Sea or oil from Arabian Sea to the China mainland?
I mean, I think Gwadar kind of, in developing Gwadar, you have a long-term option in various different ways. It is conceivable that if circumstances change at some point in the future, it could have some naval utility. To get to that stage, it needs to have the basics working there. It needs to have working power supply, needs to have a functioning water supply. So achieving a certain level of commercial functionality is a baseline. Most of the same things that you would need for it to be used in any imaginable military purposes. For now, it can be developed as a commercial port. I don't think there's even a particularly firm decision on China's side, at least, that it will be used for one thing or another. There are circumstances in which in a couple of decades or in a shorter period of time, it could be used for some transit routes with Afghanistan as well. In some imaginable, hard to imagine perhaps at the moment, but theoretically imaginable scenarios with India, in which you had more kind of cross-border, you had some degree of normalization of cross-border trade between Pakistan and India, then some of these internal connections questions also look different. But I think there's been a kind of back and forth between the two sides at different junctures in terms of who thinks it should be used for military purposes, who thinks that there's anything significant that can be done with it commercially. I think it's going to have limited commercial value even in the medium term. but it's also going to have limited military utility. And China can also continue a lot of its naval cooperation with Pakistan without having to use Gwadar. I mean, I think there's a lot of fixation on Gwadar, but there's existing cooperation that takes place through Karachi, and of course there's other port facilities that China can use, just up the coast from Gwadar as well. So I do think sometimes Gwadar can be a bit of a distraction almost. It's very it's also like the lines on the map. It's also a very kind of evocative, sort of symbolically important place, which is also why I think there'll be a degree of caution about taking certain steps there, because everyone has their eyes on it. It's a place where if you did get that sort of shift at some point, to say, okay, the PLA Navy is starting to make port calls in Gwadar or something, that's going to raise a lot of alarm bells, and China can get a lot of the things that they want out of naval cooperation with Pakistan without having to do it through Gwadar. But I still think it's understood to be a potentially useful longer term option. It's not by Chinese standards horrendously expensive. The cost of making these upgrades and things, it's not some sort of ruinously costly thing. There's some transshipment that it can be done from there as well. There are future scenarios in which Pakistan might need more port capacity, although Karachi serves perfectly well at the moment. So I mean, you can think through some potential cases in which it could have some use, but I think it's still a long way away from that yet.
Okay. And another interesting that you mention in this report is that there's one Pakistani expert you interview, and he says that we have got what we need from CPEC and the big stuff is over. So if we go by that theory, so if like the big stuff is over, now what can Pakistan expect to get from CPEC in this medium term and long term projects?
Well, some of this is also a question of what people on the Pakistani side and the Pakistani government otherwise actually want from this. I think if you look at what CPEC was in practice, the first phase of CPEC was essentially primarily a cluster of energy projects, and that was the major focal point of the investments, and that was the government's priority. It was its campaign pledge, and so in a certain sense, yes, there were a lot of other plans involved as well. A lot of other things were envisaged, but the projects that were pursued with a real level of political commitment were the energy projects. Gwadar went more slowly. Special economic zones didn't move ahead. Some of the internal infrastructure development did not proceed at the same level of pace. The energy projects were the ones that were pushed. Now the question, and the question has been there really for the last couple of years, has been, okay, so what do you, if you don't want all of these big infrastructure investments and things, if you want to rebalance it, then what is it that you do want? And China with the PTI went through a real cycle of trying to figure out, okay, we can do some socioeconomic investments and things like that, essentially providing aid. Yes, we can kind of move ahead with some of the industrial cooperation that was envisaged anyway. But I think what you used to have with it, and what you had with the previous government, was, I think, with the long-term plan, but more with the two sides' entire conception of what was going to be achieved, which was, first of all, fix the energy problem and some of the internal, then move ahead with some of the infrastructure development, then move ahead with kind of broader industrial and economic cooperation between the two sides. And in the course of all of this, you would, if all of these things were successful, start to be able to transform and put the Pakistani economy on a different and better footing. And I think you've kind of lost the sense in the last 2 to 3 years of really what the goals are with this. I mean, there are a couple more projects being added to the mix now, and everyone still talks about how important CPEC is and things. It's become much less clear what this kind of staged sequencing of what it will actually do for the country looks like. You could disagree with the previous analysis that was there, and you could say that these were the wrong priorities, and you needed to focus more on reform and less on kind of building things. All of this is completely fair enough, but I think there was a conception there of what the entire purpose of the exercise was. It's a bit fuzzier, frankly, at the moment, what that amounts to. And that's something the Chinese have struggled with as well. I mean, there's been less clarity of vision and less clarity of what it is that China can actually do, because there are things that China does well. It is actually good at executing some of these big infrastructure projects. And so if you're a government that turns around and says that you don't really believe in this anymore, or you're kind of willing to go ahead with some of these things, partly to help stimulate the economy, which is which is obviously in a difficult place, but partly also just to almost maintain the reputation of the entire thing. That's fine. I mean, you can go ahead with financing and supporting a couple more of these things, but what ultimately is it going to do for the Pakistani economy? I think it's a bit less clear even what the intentions are around that now. And I think, again, this is one of the kind of, there's been a stepping back on the Chinese side, and the quote from the Pakistani expert, kind of China hand, they're saying, the big stuff is over. I think that's also because the Chinese think the big stuff is over. They're willing to do the necessary now to keep things moving ahead and have some sort of image of the thing working. But I think their sense that this is going to connect to something that is genuinely going to have a qualitative impact on the Pakistan's long-term economic prospects, that I don't see anymore. I think that's kind of gone. And again, maybe it was unrealistic, but I think for 2 or 3 years the two sides were both engaged in a process that at least had some of these longer-term goals in mind, and I struggle to see that anymore.
Right. So if we now pivot away from the internal dynamics of CPEC to some of the external factors affecting it, last week there was this basic exchange and cooperation agreement signed between US and India, and in which the US will share the geospatial intelligence with India, and it will be like very beneficial for the Indian armed forces in terms of intelligence and targeting its targets. But Pakistan's Foreign Office has taken note of it, and they think that this will destabilize the region. But again, here in Pakistan, people are perceiving it from the lens of that Belt and Road, that US is helping US is helping India because of its rivalry with China, and because China is linked with Pakistan through this CPEC. So ultimately, the CPEC and Belt and Road can be affected from this cooperation agreement, because the Gilgit-Baltistan region of Pakistan is the entry route for any CPEC projects from China into Pakistan. So do you see a threat or a linkage between CPEC, Belt and Road, and this BICA agreement signed between US and India recently?
I wouldn't really say so. I mean, my understanding of this is, of course, it is bound up in China-related questions, but I don't think so much the Belt and Road and CPEC, but rather I think step by step, as the US-India relationship has been upgraded, and as expectations have shifted there is more of a sense, both on the Indian side, that there are certain things that they're willing to accept by way of cooperation with the US, and that will be useful in dealing with some of the China-related issues, including now at the border, given what we've seen unfolding there, and on the US part, that again, without involving themselves excessively in some of these issues, where I think they're still quite careful on the China-India border question, at India's behest, and India, I think, until what played out this year, I think had the sense that it was possible to manage and navigate lots of this essentially bilaterally with China, and that the US should, and anyone else should step aside from this. I think there's more of a willingness now to accept certain forms of additional support, and the sense that it can be managed entirely bilaterally. I think, given some of Chinese actions more recently, I think that's somewhat less present. But I mean, it's part of the broader US-India ongoing upgrades in the security relationship that have been unfolding for some time as well. Very little of that's been directed at CPEC or Belt and Road related questions. I mean, I think on the US side, I'm even now, even with all the sort of the speeches and things given, Alice Wells' speech and these sorts of things, I don't think there's such a the view on CPEC in the US system is kind of mixed. I'm not sure that it's seen in particularly hostile terms. And even if you go and look at the kind of critical commentary and things, the concerns on the US side have been less about logistical issues relating to CPEC or the kind of China's advances in Pakistan or things like that. They've been concerns that are there around a lot of the Chinese projects, debt-related issues, whether the US ends up in a situation either through the IMF or otherwise of having to bail out Chinese lenders. These have been the kind of points of tension in the last 2 to 3 years around the CPEC related questions. But I mean, I think for some period of time, the US was sort of relatively happy to see China pushing ahead with some of these things. They thought some of them might be quite useful for the Pakistani economy. Going further back in time, the US had really actively encouraged China to step up its economic commitments in Pakistan because they thought it would potentially have some kind of a stabilizing impact. And I think there's still a kind of mixed view on some of these CPEC related investments on the US part. I would actually almost go so far as to say that they were supportive of CPEC in the earlier stages, at least in principle, but I think didn't necessarily want to come out and do that publicly given India's reaction to this. But I don't think there's been a huge amount of hostility to CPEC on the US side. This isn't true. This is the Belt and Road as a whole. I think the US has taken an increasingly critical view. But I within the Belt and Road, I'd say there's probably still a little bit less concern about some of the continental projects and probably a bit more focus on maritime locations and some of what plays out there. That's where I think the big worry about dual use facilities and these sorts of things is at its peak, particularly ports and some of these issues, and then the technology related questions. China's Huawei's 5G networks. China's expanding role into digital infrastructure, but in Pakistan that was a done deal anyway. I mean, in terms of telecom side, and I mean most of these kind of new areas of cooperation, whether it's fiber optics or satellites or all of these sorts of things, for security and strategic reasons, this was the direction that Pakistan was heading in anyway. And I don't think there's a huge kind of counter push on the US side against this. So I don't think that's really where the US-India cooperation is undoubtedly directed at China, but I don't think it's directed at CPEC as such. I just don't see that being a material part of it.
Right. So now if we move to the $1 million question, and that is that who will be the elected next president of United States, and how that is going to impact the China-Pakistan relations. Because as you mentioned, Alice Wells and the policy of the Trump administration, or what it has been perceived in Pakistan, is that it is very critical to CPEC, and Pakistani government has even responded to them. And as far as Joe Biden is concerned, like there are people in Pakistan, the analysts, they think that Joe Biden can be relatively friendly to Pakistan, especially when he was vice president, when he was vice president elect. First time he came to Afghanistan and he told President Hamid Karzai that Pakistan is like 100 times more important for US as compared to Afghanistan. But again, that was a comparison between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So for now, if hypothetically speaking, if Joe Biden is elected president, do you see like a relaxation from the United States towards the Belt and Road, and that will ultimately translate into US having a less critical approach towards CPEC?
So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, of course, the relationship between the US and Pakistan has improved in the last couple of years as a result of the cooperation on Afghanistan in particular. And so I think there are kind of underlying reasons for that, and I think some of that will continue. I mean, I think the question is partly looking out at what a sort of not quite post Afghan, because everything that's going to be in play there is going to be live for some time. But I think clearly the level of strategic focus on Afghanistan, and to a certain extent some of the kind of continental commitments on the US side is diminishing, and that does result in something that is likely over the longer term to look like quite a different kind of US-Pakistan relationship. At the same time, the US-India relationship, as we were just discussing, for different structural reasons, is going to continue to intensify and deepen, and so that's going to have its own impact, and we already see the difference in the way that the US approaches, some of the kind of conflict risk scenarios in South Asia, which has really shifted, and again shifted even during the late stages of the Obama administration, and again that trend is going to continue. I think on the China front, it's also clearly the case that a lot of elements of the kind of hardening of the US position, the more competitive approach to China, is bipartisan in nature. A lot of the key people who are involved in the Biden team and the setup there are similarly minded to continue to prioritize strategic competition with China. I think the question is going to be priorities within that. My sense is that that some of these kinds of investments, which, as I have suggested, I don't think has been a major focus for the US, even during a period of time in which there has been this very critical approach to the Belt and Road. What's been done in the case of CPEC has largely been a kind of it's been criticism of it, but there's not been an attempt to kind of block or do anything obstructive. It's been, the important thing about it has been, since it's the flagship, it's going to become part of a reputational battle. It's very hard for CPEC not to form part of the reputational battle around the Belt and Road, given its elevated status. So of course, at some point, the US, if it was training its sites Belt and Road, and training its more critical attention and its public diplomacy on some of these things, then of course CPEC was going to get swept up in that. But I don't think, in terms of the priorities of competing with China for a new administration, certainly if Joe Biden is elected, but even if you were to have a continuity with the Trump administration, I don't think Afghanistan or CPEC or some of these sorts of things are likely to be a major focus for the competitive dimensions of US policy. And I think it is possible that you could have certain forms of cooperation, even not necessarily on the investments as such, but I mean, Afghanistan, even during this administration, through Khalilzad, has still been an area in which the United States and China have maintained relatively cooperative ties, and it's really been a very rare case. And that's, I think, some of the issues around the reconciliation talks and any ultimate deal and what happens in any aftermath and things. I think the US still tends to see China as being a relatively constructive actor in that regard, in a context in which there aren't very many actors that the US sees as relatively constructive. And China has its own needs in Afghanistan that are relatively well aligned with the US. So I think for insofar as that element of things is still going to be a US focus. I think it is still one of the areas in which dynamics with China are somewhat less competitive, but at the same time, the competition with China, and the sense that a global competition with China is underway, is starting to have its effects in South Asia, and it's becoming harder to kind of segment it away from some of the competition that we're seeing elsewhere. And I think that's going to be, the logic of that is also going to be hard to resist. There are some slightly different US priorities in South Asia versus the sort of competition that we're seeing in the Asia Pacific or certain other places. But some of those issues are diminishing in weight, including Afghanistan, and the issues that are rising in weight are certainly the wider contest with China in the Indo-Pacific. But I mean, CPEC, there's still not a huge amount that the US can do there, or particularly wants to do there. If you do have an improved US-Pakistan relationship, and I mean, even going back to Alice Wells' speech, a chunk of it was also talking about the potential for stronger commercial ties with between the US and Pakistan. I mean, it wasn't all a kind of CPEC attack, but I mean, I think there's an understanding and in one way an acceptance of the fact that China's going to have this role and relationship with Pakistan. This has been there for a long time, and in a set of circumstances in which the US Pakistan military relationship is never going to be what it was. Pakistan's going to be more reliant on China over time, and it's already more reliant on China on the financial side in a way that it wasn't even a few years ago. And I think that has been one of the things that CPEC has brought along in its weight. I think during a period of time in which the US and Gulf finance and things was more important, China has kind of stepped in a much more elevated way in dealing with any of the kind of economic troubles that Pakistan faces, and that's going to continue as well. And I don't necessarily see that the US is going to kind of push back particularly hard against that, even under whoever's elected in the coming in the coming week. But even now, and I think certainly for Biden, I don't think this is going to be an area of significant focus for US-China competition.
Right. So now I want to move from South Asia to Middle East and talk about China and Iran agreements and the Chinese investments in Iran. And you also made a passing reference about this thing that, and like a couple of years back, there was a news report in a website called Petroleum Economist, and last year there was this document in Persian language which was leaked, and New York Times also covered it. So this document, or what it's claimed in, is that China is going to invest $400 billion in Iran, which is a huge figure, considering even like the figures that we hear for entire Belt and Road is like 1 trillion. So in that context, this 400 billion is a huge figure for a country. So like you have been studying this Belt and Road, CPEC and everything for a long time. So do you see this China and Iran investment thing materializing? And if it does, how is it going to impact like CPEC and Gwadar port? Because there was this Chabahar port in Iran, and it was being perceived as a competitor of Gwadar. Now that China is also joining the bandwagon of Belt and Road, and Iran is also joining this bandwagon of Belt and Road. So how this is going to play up, and how this is going to affect Gwadar and CPEC?
So, I mean, first of all, as I mentioned before, I'm skeptical about that number. I mean, I think it's a fiction. And we've had that before. We had a number when Xi Jinping visited Iran previously about the projections for trade volume between the two countries, which was also a very high round number that bore no relationship to any conceivable reality or what would be feasible. And at the same time, I mean, Iran should be, and it makes sense for it to be a Belt and Road focal country. If you do a list of the countries that have need for infrastructure upgrades, have a large potential market, where China does have some other strategic interests in play, population of a certain size, Iran always made sense as a place for China to invest in on a more significant scale. And I mean, even logistically and in terms of its location, there are good reasons to make some of these commitments there as well. But it hasn't happened in the last few years for reasons that are also not necessarily going away. I mean, this is actually going to be a more important question on in terms of what happens with a potential Biden administration. I mean, clearly, what goes on with the nuclear deal will have significant implications for Pakistan, for Iran's economic situation and the capacity for outside investors to come in, because there are still the obstacles for Chinese investment have not changed particularly dramatically. Yes, there are Trappers vehicles and things like that to be able to navigate around some of the US sanctions, Kunlun Bank, all of these sorts of things. But it's still has most of the Chinese firms involved in these projects over the years have also been treading very carefully around all of these issues. They don't want to have that headache when it comes to their position in the global financial system, and the US still, through Treasury actions, has considerable power over that, and it's simply made very difficult to be able to go ahead with certain forms of financial and economic interactions with Iran. And I think some version of that is also going to is also going to continue to be true, and Chinese firms will proceed very cautiously as they have done so far. And so I think it will make sense to move ahead with investments on some sort of scale, but we've had a long period of time now of seeing why this is difficult for the financial reasons, because in different ways, of course, Iran doesn't want to have this level of dependence on China. It never has. And so I'm still on the lower side of estimates in terms of what's likely to move ahead. The Chabahar Gwadar question is an interesting one. There've been points in which it's been marketed as a competitor. When you talk to some of the people involved on the two sides, there are actually ways in which the ports can function in a relatively complementary way for transshipment, in particular from Gwadar to Chabahar. It will enable kind of larger vessels that can go into Gwadar, and then the smaller ones go on to Chabahar. I mean, there are ways of developing relatively cooperative arrangements there between the two ports. They don't inherently have to function as competitors. So I think what plays out there remains to be seen. But until these things actually start moving ahead at scale on the ground in Iran, and it's lagged significantly in the last few years, well below what you would have expected when the Belt and Road was first announced, and you were looking around and seeing the sort of locations where these sorts of investments would make sense. So I think these figures bounce around and make a lot of news, but the experience from the last period of time has been, see what happens practically, and I think it's many of these things start moving ahead on scale.
Right. So my last question is about you also mentioned in your report about China is very wary of hiding the problems with CPEC because it will feed the global BRI backlash. So you also mentioned about the reputational risk of CPEC, which can affect the BRI. So now that the big stuff in CPEC is over, and now only the medium or the negligible projects are remaining, what do you think would be the ideal end game of CPEC for the BRI. So far, like there has been like problems which has affected the BRI machinery, but what can happen or what China would want from Pakistan and CPEC in the remaining years so that it like positively affects the future or the progress of Belt and Road as a whole?
I think what's possible now is, and I think what's expected now is projects moving ahead on enough of a scale to be able to say that CPEC hasn't slowed down, that it's still moving ahead, that it's still successful, and to maintain the narrative of kind of cooperation and economic activity and all of these sorts of things. And I think that's where it's got to. If you strip out the kind of plans to have a more dramatic impact on the Pakistani economy, and you say, okay, if what is left over on this is largely reputational, but also because of some of the opacity around CPEC, it's actually a bit easier to control some of the messages on CPEC than it has been on some of the other cases. It took a lot of time before you got reporting coming out on a significant scale on just how much of a slowdown and stalling that actually been with CPEC. And I think a lot of the issues that there've been, and some of which I touched on in the report, just have been kind of buried because it's hard to get clarity on this. You're one of the people who's been able to dig in and pull some of these stories out in a serious way over the years. But it's actually been a more challenging case than in places where the kind of big backlash and issues and things that have played out, it's played out much more publicly and much more evidently, whereas in Pakistan's case, it's still been possible for China to kind of squash a lot of this narrative. But I think to maintain the narrative, they need to push ahead with enough to be able to have what I think is still expected to be a visit from Xi Jinping at some point, with a couple of big new things that they can point to, which is why the ML1 story that you were working on recently, I think is important, because that would then be the single biggest ticket item on of the CPEC projects. I mean, in terms of scale, it would be the one really substantial addition and that would have an impact on the story around this, because then they'll say, well, no, the big stuff is still happening. Look, there's ML1. And so I think if you have one or two of these sorts of things, I think that's probably, from a reputational perspective, enough to keep things spinning along, and to be able to kind of treat all the analysis that people have been doing on the diminishing of ambitions and the downscaling and all of this, to be able to say, no, it's still fine. It's still, things are still moving ahead. And to be fair, even 20 billion, 25 billion or whatever is still a significant amount. I mean, this is not a negligible investment package that has gone ahead. And I think if you wound back to 2014 or to 2015 and you said, how much do you, what would be considered a success? What would be considered, in the context of the China-Pakistan economic relationship, what looks like something that it really is a big material change? The sums of money that have gone in and the investments that have gone in do represent a significant forward in terms of the overall size of the economic and investment relationship between the two countries. It's just that they're not investments, and the CPEC package is just no longer, I think, intended to achieve some of the loftier goals that both sides had talked about in the first place.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for taking time and participating in our show. With your answer, the time of our show is over. And once again, I would like to thank you. It was very insightful. We got to talk about your report, and you elaborated on a lot of points. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks very much, Adnan.
And with this, the time is over for today's show, and I'll be back next week with a new topic. Till then, I'm Adnan Aamir signing out.